The following lecture will be discussing police operations and the way that the police are organized. Now, organization of the police emphasizes the superior-subordinate relationship. There are levels of rank, with the chief being at the highest level, followed by the deputy chief. And then each department has its own way of being organized. You can have a commander or a captain in charge of a division. And below that would be a lieutenant. And some departments like Berkeley and San Francisco have inspectors, which are right above the rank of sergeant. The sergeant's a street supervisor, first line supervisor, and corporals, you see a lot of corporals out there. Most of them are only field training officers. They're not really supervisors. However, they have rank on just regular officers that are at the scene. Typically, a senior officer will have seniority over a junior officer and can make decisions, but they're also held accountable for the decision-making process. Supervisors or persons of higher rank are empowered to give orders to those in the lower end of the ranking structure. However, they're also responsible. If they make a decision on something and it's a bad decision, they could be disciplined, and the officers who are ordered to actually carry out that order are not subject to discipline. In the United States, the nature of policing is really decentralized, and there's a variety of organizational and service activities that each department offers. It's solely set up, or it's based upon what the city leaders want, the politicians in charge, and how that goes down toward the city manager and the police chief as to what they'll concentrate on with their police department. Majority of departments have 30 or fewer officers. However, there are a number of departments that have 1,000 or more. The population and city size don't always dictate how large a police department will be. However, it's usually the minimum staffing should be 1 per 1,000 capita. The police have traditionally been organized in a military manner with a hierarchical structure of ranks in order to make discipline, control, and accountability primary values. This is thought to assist in efficient mobilization of the police as a means to control police in order to protect civil liberties. In other words, the supervisors can order officers to treat people a certain way or handle situations a certain way. The police departments are designed to fulfill 5 functions. They have to apportion workload among members and units according to a logical plan. This is usually done by doing an analysis of crime in a city and developing beats or boundaries that officers respond to and are responsible for writing case reports of anything that occurs in that designated area. They're also supposed to ensure lines of authority and responsibility, make sure that they're definite and direct as possible, and that goes with the ranking structure. They're supposed to specify unit of command throughout, so there's no question as to which orders to follow and which not to follow. They place responsibility accompanied by the commiserate authority, meaning that if a sergeant gives an order, they can hold an officer responsible if they don't follow that order. And again, if the order is a bad order and something bad happens, the sergeant's held responsible. They also should coordinate efforts of members and units so that they all work harmoniously to accomplish a mission, meaning that the patrol officers are supporting the investigative branch of detectives and vice versa, and that day watch is providing information to the graveyard shift before them so that they know when crimes are occurring, because typically the day watch is going to take cases that occurred on graveyard. If they never communicate with graveyard shift will never improve in lowering the crime rate. Allocations of resources. So districts or precincts can be established throughout a city depending on how big it is. There could be separate functions established for patrol, investigations, traffic, vice, and juvenile. Usually only mid-sized cities have vice and juvenile units. The smaller cities, officers do what's called generalist work. They do a variety of activities, where bigger cities, officers are trained to do specialized work, and that's called specialization. Right here I gave you Ramos PD. What would I do with 100 officers? And if you could see, I start with the Chief of Police, and below the Chief of Police I just have 3 divisions, and they're all headed by a captain: Service Division, Operations Division, Administration Division. In Service Division I placed Communications or Dispatch, Records, and Jail, and I would also probably have my evidence room. Under operations, I was going to have a captain who would command a patrol division. I'd have some lieutenants in there and sergeants, and they would be the backbone of the police department. I'd also have detective division, which would be commanded by a lieutenant, and they'd be divided into 2 areas: crimes against persons and crimes against property. I'd also would have some sort of a CSI setup, crime scene investigators that would show up and do their work. The last division would be administrative division, because I need to hire people, I need to train people, I need to keep my budget together, and I need to have an internal affairs division that would investigate police misconduct for me. Most departments are going to have at least the first 3 or the first 2 that I have listed here: patrol and investigations. If they're bigger, they're going to have traffic, vice, and juvenile detail. I'm going to quickly go over what the responsibilities are of state and federal agencies, and I'm going to stay with California as far as the state agencies go. First, we have the California Highway Patrol, and they're responsible for safety of motorists on the highway. Their jurisdiction is the highway and unincorporated areas with regard to traffic. They also teach traffic safety courses. They train local agencies in traffic enforcement and handle specific investigations, including traffic, commercial enforcement, commercial scales for the big trucks, school bus inspections. They handle all school bus investigations. If there's a wreck with a school bus, even if it's in the city limits, they're responsible for looking at that. And they check on licensing of a variety of different service stations, including smog, light, and brake stations. California Department of Motor Vehicles, or DMV, is responsible for registering motor vehicles and collection of fees and maintaining the registration records. They test and license drivers and collect fees and maintain CDL records. They also administer financial responsibility laws, ensuring that persons have liability insurance. DMV has its own investigators, and they're responsible for looking at fraudulent documents, unlawful ownership transfers, altered license plates, forged or counterfeit vehicle reg, or driver's licensing. They're also responsible for licensing auto dealers and dismantlers and investigating applicants for auto salesman licenses. At the state level, the Attorney General is elected by the population in the state, and they're the principal law enforcement officer in the state. They represent the state in any civil or criminal actions. They also are in charge of the state court system to make sure that everything's running properly and budgets, etc. And they're Chief Administrative Officer, State Department of Justice. In California, we have Bureau of Investigations and Bureau of Narcotic Enforcement that work for the Attorney General's office. They're also a legal advisor to state agencies. In their Bureau of Criminal Identifications, this is where all fingerprints are kept. They assign ID numbers to every person arrested in the state and provide lab and criminalistics aid to small departments. They also will provide investigative assistance when requested and investigate narcotics investigations. They usually are the ones that come up with the big money for big undercover buys, and they also handle things like smaller departments that may not be prepared to deal with serial murder cases. They'll handle it for them. The Commission on Peace Officers and Standards and Training is called POST. POST is a state agency that establishes minimum selection and training standards for police candidates in California. They operate a professional certification program and provide management counseling service. They finance police training reimbursement from criminal and traffic fine assessments, and they can mandate training that officers must get on an ongoing basis, like what they call um, perishable training, things that you forget how to do, like driving and shooting and baton training, things like that. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is a primary investigative agency for the federal government. They're not a police agency, but they're an investigative body, and they're assigned to investigate violations of federal law. They investigate espionage laws like terrorism, sabotage and internal security laws, subversive activities, and other federal violations not assigned specifically to another agency. They also look at interstate flight to avoid prosecution. The post office has what's called the postal inspectors, and they're responsible for investigating schemes to defraud by mail. They also look at burglary and crimes in mail facilities, illegal gambling via mail, any obscene material sent through the mail, or extortion through the mail. Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, is a branch of the FBI, and they investigate dangerous drugs and marijuana laws. Secret Service under the U.S. Treasury Department is responsible for protecting the President, the Vice President, their families, President-elect, declared presidential and VP candidates, and they guard and protect all foreign embassies in Washington, D.C., protecting visiting heads of state, investigate counterfeiting, investigate theft, forgery, or alteration of government checks, and now they're in charge of investigating internet crime and cellular phone fraud. Immigration Naturalization Service, U.S. Department of Justice, has combined with the Border Patrol, Customs, and the Transportation Security Administration, and they're under the new Department of Homeland Defense. They're supposed to check all immigration, naturalization, law enforcement, patrol borders to prevent illegal entry into the United States. They have also another group that's under Homeland Defense is the Coast Guard. ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division of the U.S. Treasury Department, is responsible for federal alcohol and tax laws, federal firearm laws, federal gun control laws, and import laws. Armed Forces Police. Each branch of the service has their own intelligence and investigative units. They have their own specific jurisdiction, and they must cooperate with local agencies. They can include Department of the Army, the Navy, which has the Naval Investigative Service and Shore Patrol, the Air Force, the U.S. Marshal is responsible for transportation and guarding federal prisoners. They serve federal warrants for arrest and serve federal civil processes. They also provide protection in civil rights matters. The U.S. Marshals are the ones that would show up at a university if a certain group was not allowed entry into the university. Department of Forestry and U.S. Park Service. All U.S. parks like Yosemite, the big ones, have their own little police department. And those are federal police officers. They're rangers, and they're there to enforce laws in the park. Additional law enforcement includes Fish and Game, Coast Guard, which I talked about, the county sheriff, local police, and campus police for different universities and colleges. Police response and action. So police in a democracy are organized mainly to be reactive, meaning they go to a call after the citizens call for service, rather than proactive, meaning that they're out looking for things before they occur. Police arrive after the fact or after crimes occurred, so most of the reporting by victims and observers define the boundaries of policing. Three factors characterize the organizational context within which police decisions are made. First, the police are the gateway to the justice system. Their discretionary decision to arrest or not arrest determines which cases go into the system. If they collect the proper amount of evidence correctly, it could determine the strength of a prosecutor's case. And so it's kind of interesting because the fate of the defendants, the ultimate fate, rests with another group. It's not the police that actually convict them. They make the arrest, it rests with prosecutors and judges. So the outcomes are in the hand of another professional group with a higher social status than the police. And police are always in an odd situation because they have to act in accordance with a code of ethics, possess authority, and use discretion, yet they are still within a chain of command. So if you decided that for the benefit of whatever group you're working with, you're not going to arrest somebody, and all of a sudden your sergeant comes up and says, arrest that person, well, all your discretionary powers just went out the window. Organizational response. The administration of a police department decides how calls are processed and how police are going to respond. For the most part, some of the newest things that are out there that help police respond quickly are the centralization of communications. The 911 numbers and two-way radios has altered the way that police address crime problems in neighborhoods. Now they have to react to instructions from communication centers and report back for further instructions or give dispositions on cases or ask for assistance. Differential response. What police departments are finding is that you may not have to have an officer there to do a good job in taking care of a case. Dispatchers have to make decisions on to whether to send a police officer or not. It's been found through research that delayed response may be just as effective depending on the nature of the call. Examples of differential police response include phone reports, mail-in reports, internet reports, front counter reports, or policy development to not take certain types of cases. Like if you have a non-injury accident with $500 or less of damage, police won't take a report. If you have a auto burglary, many police departments make you do a mail-in or a phone-in report. Differential police response research finding. Fast police response accounted for less than 5% of serious arrests. Most calls don't require a fast response. Differential police response does not alienate citizens if they're informed of why you're using a different type of response. And it can save money. How do we limit patrol officer discretion? Well, it's done through the use of two-way radios. Officers just can't go out and do whatever they want anymore. They're assigned to go to specific cases, or they have mobile digital terminals, DTs, where they pick up their calls and they have to respond. Advocates of community policing, which we're going to talk about a little later, have stated that some of the communication technologies really isolate officers from the community, that they need to be out walking around. Productivity. Well, basically, activity is a measure as to whether officers are doing a good job. It could include whether or not they're writing tickets, if they're making arrests, if they're stopping suspects and filling out stop cards. It's quantity and quality. Are they being proactive? And are they recovering stolen property? But this productivity level, or this way of checking productivity, is being questioned right now, because in none of those areas are you seeing our citizen satisfaction is not really being addressed. We're paying a lot for police services, and citizens are saying we want more. We want more service. This is not the way to go. Delivery of police services. Division of responsibilities. First of all, patrol officers make up 2/3 of all sworn departments. In small communities, the patrol force constitutes the entire department. Patrol function has 3 components: answering calls for service, maintaining a police presence, and probing suspicious circumstances. The object of patrol division is to disperse officers so it limits the law-breaking opportunities and increase the likelihood that a criminal would be caught if they commit a crime out on the street. Patrol officers' presence in the community can be a major factor in reducing fear of crime. Using automobiles can do a couple different things. One of the things that's tough. It's harder to supervise somebody in a police car because you don't know where they are. They could be farther away from the beat area. Patrol mobilization. Individuals call to report crime or ask for help, and the police discover crime while on patrol. Those are the two main ways that you get out there. Purposes of patrol: to deter crime by being visible, to maintain public order, to respond quickly to emergencies, to arrest criminals, to aid citizens in distress, to facilitate movement of people or traffic, and to create a sense of safety and security. Allocations of patrol personnel. The commanders of patrol divisions decide where they're going to put officers, usually in problem neighborhoods. Proactive policing concentrates on hot spots and hot days because there's more people out. Small percentage of offenders, victims, and places. So you decide, depending on what problem areas are you're identifying in your city, where to put officers. Crime's not necessarily random. Often it's associated with certain hot spots with associated factors like the offenders are motivated because there's no police presence out there. There's suitable targets. There's like elderly people walking around with money that can be easily victimized. Or there's an absence of capable guardians against the violation, meaning that the police are not around. Preventative patrol. There have been a number of studies that have occurred, one being the Kansas City study, where they found that having more cops in the area made little difference on crime or the fear of crime. The finding contributed to shifting emphasis toward order maintenance and service in police departments. So the Kansas City Preventive Patrol experiment. It was empirical research, meaning that somebody did actually raw data that they didn't care what the outcome was going to be, and they had three different areas. They had preventative patrol, proactive patrol, and reactive patrol. Preventative meant that they put a whole bunch of officers in a district to look for crime before it occurred. And reactive patrol meant that officers just responded if people called. Districts randomly selected for this project. What was the outcome? Experimental conditions did not decrease the crime rates, crime reporting rates, people's fear of crime, opinion about police effectiveness, or police response time, meaning the time it takes for you from the time a call or something happens, how long does it take the cops to get there. But the experimental conditions did increase respect for the police in the control beats and citizen fear in the proactive beats. Assumptions supporting preventative patrol. If patrol improves response time, it permits the police to respond to trouble more rapidly, and the number of crimes are solved and arrests would increase. The number of crimes would be solved and arrests would increase, showing that you would be more effective. Now, if you look at this graph, what you see is that if officers are called to the scene between 0 and 2 minutes, there's pretty high factor of probability of arrest. If they're there right at the scene, so in other words, crimes are reported while in progress, 33.6% of the suspects are arrested. If between 0 and 1 minute, it could be as high as 20%. When it gets down to 14 minutes, it's as low as 5%. Studies indicate that police response time is not a critical factor in making an arrest. Instead, it's the citizens' response time in reporting crimes right away. So what happens is, here you could have this great 90-second response time, but if citizens call in 20 minutes later, you have a 20-minute, 90-second response time. 3 major reasons for delay of citizens not calling in can be that they find the situation ambiguous. They're not sure whether it's a police matter, and so they don't call right away. Other involved in coping with different activities, taking care of the victim, directing traffic, or helping out. And lastly, other people are conflicted about the decision, and they may go seek advice of others before they call the police. Aggressive patrol. In San Diego, they have evidence that shows that aggressive use of street stops and field interrogations resulted in a drop in a certain number of crimes, including robbery, burglary, theft, and disturbances. Some of the things they found were not as effective were sting operations, and but they found that just increasing traffic stops and field interrogations would lower crime rates. In the last lecture, we talked about community-oriented policing and the community policing era that we're in right now. This is a different approach that's emerged to try to deal with crime rates. There's two actual different ways. One is community-oriented, the other is problem-oriented, and you can also combine these two. Some of the problems that they look at are quality of life issues rather than crime. These programs are most commonly associated with attempts by the police to involve the community in making their neighborhood safe. So some of the concepts of policing: police community relations, improving the relationship between the police and the public. Team policing, decentralized decision making so that the police could easily respond to neighborhood problems, meaning that you don't necessarily respond from the police department, you have substations in neighborhoods. Problem-oriented policing, which is identifying and responding to long-term problems. Problem solving is best done at the neighborhood level, not at some distant headquarters. Locally situated police working with residents are a good problem-solving team. In community-oriented policing, citizens must actively participate with the police in fighting crime. It's kind of a bottoms-up decision-making process. And so a different thing if you're going to go for community-oriented policing, you have to have officers that are trained better. You have to look for those officers in your recruitment, because it requires different types of skills, being able to manage communities. Now, problem-oriented policing is a little bit different. You get together with the citizens and just discuss what underlying problems are evident, and then you try to figure out how to solve these problems on a long-term basis with help from the community. There's been a number of police departments that have garnered attention through a problem-oriented approach, and they have been able to address crime disorder and the fear of crime. Some of the studies have shown, in community-oriented policing studies, have shown single officer patrols are better than two officer patrols. That some of the negative factors are that officer safety, there's fear about officer safety and officer effectiveness, but the findings show that there's fewer arrests are made, fewer injuries, fewer complaints, fewer resisting arrest, but similar productivity, meaning that officers are still making arrests, but they're dealing with problems in different ways. Foot patrol experiments, because foot patrol is hot. A lot of people want officers out there walking around in their communities. The research findings show that it doesn't just reduce crime, but it did result in less fear of crime. In other words, people felt safer walking around, and it gave officers greater satisfaction. Most departments have moved to bike patrols now, where they put officers on bicycles because they can move around a little faster in bigger areas. Can proactive patrol affect crime rates? Well, I've already told you that it really doesn't, but it may help reduce some criminal activity in hotspots. Future patrol. Well, it's going to take some changes. New strategies need to be developed to maintain community cooperation and develop sensitivity to the demographic characteristics of communities and neighborhoods, meaning that you need to know the different cultures coming into your neighborhoods and what their needs are. And there needs to be more attention to service, order maintenance, and fear of crime. Investigation. Most of the time, preliminary investigations are conducted by patrol officers. Good preliminary investigations are a major factor in solving crime. Part of the investigation is the incident report, which gives details about the crime, the witnesses, and all other pertinent factors related to the case. Follow-up investigations are usually conducted by detectives who read the reports from the patrol officers. Most of the time on TV it looks like, oh yeah, the detectives are able to solve everything, but that's not true. It requires citizen cooperation, and many times the offenders known are simply known of, and the detectives simply know where to locate him or her. The following slide shows some of the new ways of solving crime, including some that have been around for a long time. Fingerprint, use of blood, use of hair, and use of DNA. And I'll give you a minute to look at this slide so that you can read the material. For investigative functions. First, suspects identified and detectives gather evidence. Number two, no suspects identified and detective seeks the identity of the suspect. Three, you maintain a surveillance over a known suspect before a crime is committed to see if they're going to go out and do a crime. Or lastly, there's no suspect, no crime, but a hunch something may be up and therefore it needs to be watched. How effective are investigations? Well, a lot of time is spent on administrative work. The chances of making an arrest are most closely linked to one that's reported. I already showed you that graph with 33% chance of catching a suspect if the crime is reported in progress, 10% chance if reported 1 minute later, and 5% chance if more than 15 minutes elapse before reporting the crime. Improving investigative effectiveness. Some of the things that are suggested are greater emphasis on collecting physical evidence, identifying witnesses, checking departmental records, and use of informants. Police managers should pay more attention to screening cases and monitoring case flow and activities with measurable productive goals, and use of targeted investigations with direct attention to career criminals. Career criminals apprehension is one of the big things going on now, and the use of computers to try to generate projections on when crimes will occur is something that's fairly new. Are detectives an elite part of the police force? Well, in some police departments they're paid more. For instance, Oakland, when you get promoted to a sergeant, you become a detective or you go back to patrol. But many of the police departments, you're really not paid more other than maybe some overtime. You get to wear civilian clothes. It's more interesting work, and you work under less departmental control on a daily basis. You can pretty much pick and choose what you want to do. There's also undercover work, infiltrating a group or posing as a victim or being involved in sting operations. Some of the dangers can be to your personal safety, your psychological problems, or limited family life because you're undercover a lot. So detectives are called in when serious crimes occur and the offender immediately is identified and apprehended. They prepare the case for the prosecutor. Or they may show up when there's no suspect at the scene, but they know where they may be able to find them. Sometimes they have to start from scratch if there's no leads. Detectives are most oftenly organized by the type of crime that they investigate: homicide, robbery, sex crimes, etc. The apprehension process. So the stages in the process are the crimes detected and the preliminary investigation is carried out. Information is gathered, what's called a hot search, immediately at the crime scene, and accurate identification is gotten from the victim and witnesses. Follow-up investigations by detective in larger cities, especially with serious crimes, and they may have to do what's called a cold search or re-interview the witnesses after the fact, searching for additional evidence. Clearance and arrest. A crime is cleared when the evidence supports the arrest of a suspect and when the suspect admits committing the offense. Clearance does not mean the suspect will eventually be found guilty. So usually the dispositions, at least the dispositions of the department I was trained in, are that if the case is closed, you've identified a suspect for arrest. If the case is suspended, it means you've done everything you physically can and it's going to be put in limbo because you don't know who the suspect is. And if the case is set for follow-up, it means you have additional clues that you need to follow up. Positive aspects of having detectives. First of all, it provides goals for police officers to work toward. And citizens expect investigations to be carried out, and they want somebody they could call, and that's what the detective does. Even though there's this mythical image of detectives on TV, they are needed, and they need to satisfy the public expectations. Specialized operations. Traffic. Most police departments will have some sort of a traffic enforcement unit. They're able to garner money for their departments. Vice details responsible for enforcing prostitution, gambling, a lot of the victimless crimes. Drug enforcement. You may have these enforcement teams that are dealing with stopping sales and use of illegal drugs on the street, actively making a lot of arrests and identifying suspects. You should be coming on to closing up your police project, and you need to check for the due dates in the on the home page or in the content modules in this program. Police actions and the rule of law. In a democratic society, police are expected to control crime while complying with the rules of law as it protects the rights of citizens, including criminal suspects. The Constitution provides protection for criminal suspects and other citizens. The amendments that really affect law enforcement include the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, the Fifth Amendment that protects against compelled self-incrimination, and the Sixth Amendment, which preserves the right to be represented by counsel. Two devices designed by the Supreme Court to make sure that officers obey the law are the exclusionary rule and the right to counsel. The exclusionary rule is a rule created by the Supreme Court that excludes illegally seized evidence from court proceedings. Search and seizure. The case called Mapp versus Ohio is one of the first cases that applied the exclusionary rule to all states, saying that if you violated somebody's Fourth Amendment rights, no matter how pertinent or relevant the evidence was, it's not going to be allowed in. Now, in order to, the Fourth Amendment says that unreasonable searches are not allowed, but it doesn't say you can't search. They have to be reasonable. And for an officer to have a reasonable search, they have to show reliable information establishing probable cause to believe that a crime has been or is being committed, and they have to describe what it is they're looking for and where it is that they're going to look for it, and they have to swear under oath that they're correct. So search warrants depend on reasonableness, depends on the three factors I talked about. That it's involved in a crime, there's probable cause to believe it, there's an affidavit, or that you swore to it. Warrantless searches. Warrantless searches include Searches accompanying arrests, some searches of vehicles, plain view searches, consent searches, and stops and frisks. Incident to arrest. Police could search a person in the areas in their immediate vicinity for weapons when a lawful arrest is made, and this is under the Chamel case in 1969. Searches without a warrant can be made just before, during, and after arrest for what we call FICE, fruits of the crime, instrumentality, or what things were used to commit the crime, contraband, or any other evidence. Consent searches. Anyone, anytime, can waive their Fourth Amendment right. They can also reinstitute that Fourth Amendment right. So someone could give you permission to search and then retract it, and you don't need a warrant in that situation. Check your discussion forum for this week's current event assignment. Police and constitutional law. Field interrogations. A field interrogation is established when you're able to establish reasonable suspicion that a crime has or is about to occur, and that the person that you're about to stop is involved in that. In a case called Terry versus Ohio, Officer McFadden in Cleveland saw some thugs about to rob a store, and he believed that they had just passed out handguns, went up, hands them up, pat searched them, and found the guns. And after that, the Supreme Court said that officers who feel that someone may be armed have the right to pat search them for weapons only. So pat search is a limited search of the outside of their clothing, not going in pockets, but just to see if they have anything on them. So stop and frisk is less than a full-blown search because you don't actually go in pockets unless you've identified something that you think is a hard object that could be used as a weapon against you. What's an arrest? An arrest is a seizure of a person under the Fourth Amendment. Now the court prefers arrest warrants for felonies, but you're not required to have one. If you want to view something, you can make an arrest. Automobiles are distinguished from homes. They're different than homes because your expectation of privacy is less. People could see in your car all the time. And the risks that evidence may be contained in a motor vehicle or may be destroyed easily are higher. So under Carroll, there's a couple of cases out, and what it says is this. You stop a suspect and you make an arrest, you could search within the front passenger compartment, including any containers, so purses or suitcases or bags or whatever, where you may find evidence of a crime. There's a whole bunch of other rules that are involved that you really need to look at in our evidence course. If you are arresting a suspect and you know from information from dispatch that maybe they did a robbery and you're looking for the gun's not in the front of the car, you can assume it's in the trunk, and it's reasonable to open the trunk with that articulated information, and that's how you could get in a trunk. But normally you wouldn't be able to do that unless you're going to tow the car and do an administrative search, and then you need to search the trunk to make sure there's no jewelry or property that later they're going to complain that you took or destroyed. Plain view searches. You have the right to seize anything that you see that's right in front of you. So plain view searches can include, give you a couple of examples, New York versus Class, guns protruding under the seat of the car. But there's cases like Arizona versus Hicks where although the stereo is in plain view, you can't remove it to check serial numbers. And again, consent. Citizens can waive Fourth Amendment and other rights allowing you to conduct a search. Interrogations. Upon arrest, a person must be informed of their rights, which include the right to remain silent, and that if they speak, it can be used in court, and the right to have an attorney if they can't afford one being appointed to them. Constitutional and ethical questions about interrogations. When do suspects get their rights against self-incrimination? Well, the only time they do in California is if they're in custody, and meaning they're under arrest or they're in arrest-like constraints, like handcuffed in the back of a patrol car. What's an interrogation? It's when you ask a question that you're going to get information that's going to be used in court against the person. How does one waive his or her rights against self-incrimination? Has to be a clear waiver. And they also can't be ambiguous. Oh, maybe I need an attorney. That doesn't get it. They have to say, I don't want to talk, and I want an attorney. When and how long can police question someone without advising them of their rights? If I'm walking down the street and I see a guy with blood on his shirt, and I stop him in relationship to some case, and the guy basically starts talking to me about the case, and I have not told him he's under arrest yet, and he knows that he's free to leave, or he feels like he's free to leave, and he eventually confesses to the case, it's all good. Or the guy calls me on the phone and I talk to him and I get him to confess to the case over the phone, and it's a tape recorded line. He's not in custody. He could have just hung up the phone at any time. And so in that sort of a situation, it's not until I actually say the magic words, you're under arrest, that I would have to advise a person their rights. What's a voluntary confession? It's where free will, the person has free will to make a decision, and that's what they use when they decide to speak to you. Miranda versus Arizona basically said that you have to warn, explain, inform, and assure that suspects know of their rights. Now, there's been some modifications of the exclusionary rule, which typically would keep evidence excluded in certain cases. Some of those things include the fact that in the Harris case, if you violate somebody's rights under the Fifth Amendment in violation of Miranda, and they give you trustworthy statements, you can use those to impeach their future testimony if they're going to jump up on the stand and lie. In Mosley, it says that a second interrogation after the suspect initially refused is okay. The guy calls the cops back to the cell and says, hey, I decide I want to talk to you. The public safety exception in the Quarles case is where Quarles is being arrested on a rape. The victim's there and identifies him. And he hides a gun in a produce area in a store. And officers ask him where the gun is because they're worried there's a bunch of kids around that might find the gun. Quarles tells them where the gun is, and they arrest him for the gun, and it's found to be admissible under the public safety exception. In Nix versus Williams is an inevitable discovery rule that says that if you violate somebody's rights, but there's another group that's already headed toward that evidence, and they would have found that evidence anyhow, then it's allowable in. And good faith exception says that if officers do everything in good faith, in other words, there's a couple of cases that were out. One of the cases where the officers couldn't find a search warrant. They could only find a narcotic search warrant. So they have a case, it's a Shepard case. They're looking for a gas can and some other evidence that Shepard used when he killed this woman and burnt her up. And they write the warrant out. They take it to a judge. They say, hey, Your Honor, we can't find the right form. Can we doctor this form up so that you know what we're looking for? We know what we're looking for, and it allows us to go do this. And the judge said, sure. So they went out and served the warrant, and another judge overturned it saying they had the wrong form. And eventually the U.S. Supreme Court said, listen, the officers acted in good faith, and we're going to allow the evidence in. This is a list of your key terms for this section. I'll let you look at this for a minute. You could also pause the movie and watch this. This is the end of this lecture.